serving...
It takes two.
Hysteria engendered by the collapse of the state into the time of troubles was remarkable even by prevailing standards. When the first false Dmitri ascended the throne, he took a Polish wife, Marina. Then, 11 months later, when he was killed, she was captured and held in this house. Then she escaped and went into hiding. When the second false Dmitri emerged, she came out of hiding and greeted him as her long-lost husband, although he bore no resemblance whatever to the first false Dmitri. When the second false Dmitri was killed, she galloped off together with a savage horseman from the south, presumably in order to lead a quiet domestic life on horseback, and she never claimed that this man was the third Dmitri. Well, all these events were followed by the populace then with the same avidity that a modern public follows a television serial, with one great difference. In those days, the action was live and the corpses were dead. From the outset, it had not been easy for the Russians. Western Europe had well-defined frontiers created by sea, river, mountains, and to the west an ocean with promises of untold wealth. Russia had nothing but uninflected land, a horizon bristling with disagreeable surprises. It was as though the European train passed through the station on its way to a brighter technological and humanistic future, with Russia always late, running along the platform, seeking to gain access to the moving carriages, only to be harassed by savage porters and pushed away by Catholic dignitaries, Polish nobles and Teutonic knights from the windows of the first-class compartment. Yes, the Russians always fell back exhausted to wait for the next train. Until an important event, the arrival of a man who said, well, if they won't let us share, we'll build whatever is needed ourselves. The 14th child of Tsar Alexis and his second wife, Peter the Great, was born within the walls of the Kremlin on the 30th of May, 1672. And it was apparent immediately that here was no ordinary child. First of all, his rate of growth was phenomenal. In maturity, he was only a whisker or two short of 7 foot. When he walked, others had to run to keep up with him. He had the most enormous energy and applied it in every possible direction with the greatest of talent. When he was young, he used to play soldiers with his friends. He'd divide them into 2 camps, and they would fire leather cannonballs at each other. Well, this was only the sketch of a dream, and it had to be filled out. Being of a temperament to enjoy the thrills of discovery and finding his mind wandering in the presence of tutors, he was largely self-taught. He always wrote and read with some difficulty, but he acquired other techniques such as arithmetic. He was an excellent carpenter. This is one of his lathes, and the room is full of contraptions belonging to him. But his love of the sea began to dominate all the other attractions of his life.
He began to realize that ships could be induced to sail against the wind, and by acquiring many scraps of information of that kind, he began to understand the British and Dutch mastery of sailing. And with that came the realization that power in trade was possible only through a mastery of the sea.
This statue of Peter stands over the harbor of Taganrog, and it's remarkable in that it is life-size. His problems now were at least as great as his ambitions. Somehow he had to make sense of this enormous land of his. Russia was very backward, largely illiterate, and worse, self-satisfied with her own primitive condition. Some of the boyars and the clergy liked nothing better than to wallow in their own peculiar habits, their Russianness, undisturbed by novelty and other heretical concepts. In Peter's vision, it was the land which was to blame for all this, the land which stretched like a carpet for thousands of ungovernable miles, and always in a direction of no particular strategic importance. He decided it was time to open the windows of this large, airless room, windows overlooking the sea. The first thing he did was to mobilize every alien with even the vaguest knowledge of ships and of navigation. Then he dragooned peasants, hundreds of peasants, to cut down whole forests of trees and to mold the timbers in new and unexpected ways. Of necessity, this shipyard had to be inland, but in a remarkably short time, the fleet was ready. It left Voronezh downriver, this incredible armada of men of war, fire ships and support barges. Its destination, the town of Azov, under Turkish occupation. The Turks were expecting the usual battle on land. The surprise was complete. The fall of Azov marked the first Russian naval victory. The door was open, if only a crack. Today, there is nothing surprising about Soviet seafaring. They have an enormous merchant service and are no strangers to the more sinister application of naval know-how, nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers, so that it's difficult to realize today the impact of their first appearance on salt water as belligerents. Well, when this news, both alarming and surprising, spread to the European courts, Peter decided to cash in on this by suggesting to many European nations a kind of holy alliance against the Turks, an alliance of Christian nations against the Turkish infidel. In some quarters, the Turks were regarded as a more immediate menace than the Russians, but on the whole, the suggestion had a cool reception, for the simple reason that the Europeans didn't see why they should wake a sleeping dog, especially in the company of one who was very much awake and had a reputation of being unpredictable. Nevertheless, contact with the West was indispensable. Despite the cold shoulder, Peter sent a large delegation of over 200 men into Europe. One of the members of this team was an able seaman by name Mikhailov, who happened to be just under 7 foot tall. This was not surprising, since it was none other than the Tsar himself in yet another of his innumerable plebeian disguises. The mission was not merely to spread the Russian view of life, but also to learn. Well, the learning part of the mission went well. They learned a great deal more about shipbuilding. They learned about gunnery, about ballistics. In fact, the great Russian artillery tradition was born at this time. They also learned about canals, because Peter wished to connect the great network of rivers with canals, and so he learnt about those. And he invited as many foreigners as possible to come to Russia and instruct the Russians. As for the teaching aspects, well, it was too early. Everybody realized Russia would have to learn a lot more herself before being able to teach. In fact, one tactless tongue was heard to remark within earshot of these long-haired and bearded creatures that here was no more than a collection of baptized bears. The remark must have rankled because Peter began to regard beards as a symbol of all that was smug and retrogressive. And as soon as he got back to Russia, a year and a half after he had left it, he personally shaved the beards off many boyars. Those who flatly refused to be shaved had to pay a beard tax, with a license visibly attached to the hairs to show that the tax had indeed been paid, much as on a modern automobile, an idea typical of Peter the Great.
Как тебе понравилась наша маленькая прогулка по палубе?
Little walk! We must have been 10 miles round this damn deck.
В таком случае твои мили длиннее моих.
Oh, I had to run to keep up with you.
Это потому, что я тороплюсь. Так много надо сделать, и так мало времени, чтобы успеть.
I didn't get half the interesting things you were telling me about.
Ты должен слушать на ходу. Ну да, важно то, что люди делают, а не то, что они говорят. Вот в чем беда с Россией. Люди говорят и ничего не делают. Хуже. Они говорят для того, чтобы ничего не делать. Еще до того, как я взялся за дело, бороды внушали им уважение. А народ был приучен все мерить, все бороды мерить на аршин мудрости. А потом ножницами рык, и бороды нет. А куча волос на полу уже никому не напоминает о мудрости. А еще выше. И все славы и подбородки империи сразу же обнажились.
But you also drew teeth, didn't you?
Не по этим же причинам. Да, я занимался в то или иное время, может быть, занимался даже всем, чем должен заниматься мужчина. Я дергал зубы, да, когда это некому было делать. И знаешь, что я скажу тебе о врачевании зубов? Когда человек орет, значит, ты тащишь то, что нужно. Я привык расправляться с ситуацией по мере ее возникновения. Если для того, чтобы построить корабль, нужно стать подмастерьем, я стану подмастерьем. Если, будучи императором, мне будет неудобно подслушивать важные замечания иностранцев, я стану морским юнгой, дабы не вызвать подозрения. Я должен научиться познать. И я дойду в этом желании познания до предела. Я должен знать. Да. А знаешь, что я тебе скажу? Многие иностранцы по темпераменту очень похожи с нашими бородатыми боярами. Угу. Да-да, у них есть знания, но нет радости открытия. У них появилась бородатость ума. Да-да. А я мог бы взять их хитрым подвохом. Я так взял турок и так взял шведов. Почему? Потому что я знаю, чего можно ожидать от них. А они нет. Кто имел преимущество?
You did.
Ты соображаешь. Да. Ты мог бы мне помочь. Я бы согласился тебя взять. Да-да, из тебя получился хороший министр. Или патриарх.
I wouldn't know where to begin.
Многие мои беды ушли в прошлое, если бы во главе церкви стоял мужчина, подобный тебе. Ну-ну, ты же все это знаешь. Из меня мог бы получиться прекрасный митрополит. Ну, если бы у меня не было только своих дел по горло. Ты знаешь, что главное в этом деле? Это научиться властно произносить вещи очевидные. Ну и Борода, конечно. Она может вырасти, как капуста. Ты немного задал мне вопросов. Почему так?
Well, you didn't give me the opportunity.
Я знаю. Знаю, я сам все рассказывал.
Yes, you talked all...
Ты должен быть счастлив.
I am happy.
Ты так смущаешься, чуть не покрылся румянцем. А жаль, что ты не женщина.
Why?
Ладно, ты никогда не забудешь меня. До конца своих дней. Но теперь, в отсутствие женщины, я предпочитаю напиться.
Well, in that case, I'm going downstairs.
Не в моих правилах пить в одиночку. Вот твоя бутылка. Выпьешь? Будет еще. Много. А теперь выпьем. За радость открытия, за знания и за боль.
On May the 1st, 1703, the city of St. Petersburg was inaugurated here. And the river on which the city stands, which gives it its magnificent proportions, the Neva, pretty enough to be a girl's name, and yet in Finnish it merely means mud. It was really no place to build a city. Thousands died in its construction. It was said, in fact, that the city was built on the bones of its creators. Even when the city was a reality, the tradition of sacrifice continued. 60,000 men are believed to have died from mercury poisoning while gilding the dome of St. Isaac's Cathedral 150 years later. This is Peter's vegetable garden, punctuated by statues. It's now a public park. Russian art has always been based on something seen and observed. And it's very strange that they discovered classicism right at the beginning of the city of Leningrad, of course. They were too late for the original classicism we all were, except the Romans and the Greeks. But they were not too late for the neoclassicism. And it always showed a rather strange formality which had nothing really to do with reality as known by them or anyone else. At a time when Russia was beginning to discover the importance of the sea, this lady is the spirit of navigation. Be hard to tell if you met her casually, except that she carries a pulley around with her, and she has a map and a compass. Also, when they were beginning to build Leningrad on the basis of this garden, over there is Peter's original hut from where the whole idea germinated. Architecture was tremendously important. This is the other lady, her sister, who is addicted to architecture as the other one is to navigation. You'd also never know that she was an architect, except here for some plans, a pair of calipers, and some bricks, which he has successfully built up to have something to lean on. Another advantage of classicism is that the greatest horrors known to man could be depicted coldly, calmly, in a matter-of-fact way. And over there is a charming statue of Saturn gobbling up one of his own children as a kind of hors d'oeuvre, out of fear, out of jealousy, out of anticipation of unpleasant things to come from that boy. And whatever excesses the Tsars indulged in throughout history, well, the Russians could say it was nothing as half as bad as that. Peter was spectacular at getting what he wanted. His successes in that regard were dramatic and flamboyant. His successes in another regard were rather less spectacular, and that was in dealing with the amorphous giant of Russia. In fairness to Peter, it must be said that even the most qualified
of European experts would have failed to make much sense of this elephantine country. Illiteracy and lack of communications were still, as ever, the twin scourges. Peter tried everything. The Senate was the governing body, but he instituted so-called colleges, which functioned much as ministries do today. There was a college of foreign affairs, one for the army and the navy, and a college of mining and manufacture, and some more vaguely named, like a college of revisions. And there were changes in local government, many of them misconceptions of Swedish or German ideas with no particular application to Russia. And the more they tried to simplify and to streamline, the more evident it became that the chains of command were becoming ever more tangled and knotted. And whatever solution could be found, one fact was absolutely clear, that an enormous country has to have an enormous bureaucracy, a fact which has remained evident to this day. Peter became eventually so exasperated with the crushing cost of his campaigns and the morass back home that he was even reduced to offering handsome rewards to anyone who could come up with bright ideas about taxation. And that fact in itself is an eloquent commentary on the state of his new society. Overdressed for here. These are the grounds of Peter's palace in Petrosdvorets, not far from Leningrad. Huge palaces were essential for public relations, but Peter always preferred the informality of more plaisir, his pleasure. With his intense activities, his prolonged absences, and his dedication to the future of an entire nation, Peter can hardly be described as having been an ideal parent. Oh, he did make infrequent attempts to befriend his only surviving son, Alexis, but Alexis was left too long in the company of priests, who did their best to inculcate in the young man a horror of the father's heresies, which would have to be expiated sooner or later, however successful they might seem at the moment. And at the very moment that Russia's star was in the ascendant in the firmament of Europe, Alexis humiliated his father by running to Vienna and asking for the protection of the Emperor of Austria as a political refugee. Well, there was intense diplomatic activity of the nature of which we can guess. And at the end of it, the Austrians were forced to extradite the young deserter. Peter locked his rancid hopes somewhere in the depth of his unsentimental heart and had the young man arrested for treason and tortured. The judges were in a terrible dilemma. They were caught between their feelings of compassion for the tragedy of a family and what they deemed to be their duty. And finally, they condemned Alexis to death. But the lad cheated the gallows by dying in his cell under circumstances as enigmatic as the workings of Peter's mind. Peter, perhaps feeling that the end was near, decreed that from now on, the throne should not pass automatically to the next in line, but rather that the Tsar himself should designate his successor. And then, with wonderful inconsistency, failed to do just that. Instead, he died. He died in an action which was as unkingly as it was human. He dived into the icy sea to attempt the rescue of some fishermen whose boat had capsized. He caught cold, and the cold proved fatal. So the sea, which he had courted for so long, at last responded to his advances. an extremely positive character, as anybody with a sense of mission is bound to be. And as such, he's still very much appreciated in the less romantic Russia of today. There are always freshly cut flowers on his tomb in this cathedral in the Peter and Paul fortress in Leningrad, a city much more Peter's than Lenin's. Lenin himself only knew it as Petrograd. It was renamed in his honor several days after his death. Well, nobody knows who puts the flowers there, but they are never absent and they are always fresh. Peter's hope was to make the people part of his personal evolution and to march them as an army towards the sea in order to experience fresher winds which would invigorate the body and clear the mind and blow away the cobwebs of habit. And the flowers on his tomb are his recompense. He's not forgotten. The gap which Peter left in the fabric of the Russian state was enormous and impossible to fill. A new time of troubles might quite easily have followed his death, except for one important element. Whereas the provinces were as somnolent as they always had been, the city itself had changed. The foreign influence was deeply ingrained into the nascent majesty of St. Petersburg. Catherine, Peter's widow, followed on the throne for a short while. Peter II and Peter III went in and out of sight like saints on a cathedral clock, to be followed by Anne, Peter the Great's niece, and finally Elizabeth, his daughter. Nothing in any way remarkable about any of these brief reigns, except that there was a sudden emphasis on Western niceties. For instance, there was a school for etiquette which opened, as well as one for ballroom dancing. Small things, perhaps, and yet for Russia, primordially important. They fitted well with the new, elegant architecture. Neither of the two women who ruled at this time can be said to have been lacking in either character or will. Anne was a strapping girl with a short neck who liked firing rifles, and she surrounded herself with Germans, and this was the cause of her ultimate downfall. Elizabeth was as handsome a woman as her father had been a handsome man, and it was not all she had in common with Peter the Great. They both had feckless youths. But Peter recovered from his, and Elizabeth really didn't ever quite recover from hers. At the moment that she seized power, her paramour was a sergeant of the guard, and she packed him off to Siberia without his tongue, so that he was unable to regale his fellow convicts with tales of saucy life in the palace. Elizabeth is reputed to have had upward of 15,000 ball gowns scattered through the various imperial cupboards. Unlike her father, she had time between fittings to select a successor to her throne. Her choice fell on her nephew, son of her sister Anne, Peter of the House of Holstein. He accepted the challenge and brought with him his young bride, Sophie, a Lutheran like himself. Later, Sophie would become Orthodox and change her name to Catherine in order to cast her radiance about her and enter history. When Elizabeth died, Peter shocked all and sundry by his performance at her funeral. He pulled some hideous faces which came easily to him, and he attempted to induce the monks in the procession to break step. Catherine, for her part, behaved impeccably under her pile of funeral veils. Well, Peter lasted 6 pathetic months. He showed no judgment in anything, with the possible exception of the moment when Catherine was brought to bed of a child of unknown paternity, when he acknowledged it as his own, possibly with a little relief. Catherine seems to have been a woman of enormous prowess in the bedchamber. Her lover at the moment of her husband's fall was a certain Count Orloff of the Preobrazhensky Regiment of Guards. He was one of several brothers who seemed to operate as a team. And he and one of the brothers struck at the moment that Peter was away from the capital, and they caused Catherine to be acclaimed by the public and put her into the Winter Palace. And when Peter found out his wife's public disloyalty, he crumbled. He begged to be allowed to emigrate to his favorite flatlands back home in Holstein. But before anyone had time to refuse or to accede to this request, he was dead. One or all of the Orloffs declared to Catherine that he had died in a quarrel, which was tantamount to the modern dictator's formula of while trying to escape. Foreigners came in their droves to St. Petersburg, lured by the wealth and opportunity of the capital. Architects, artisans, and technicians produced opulence to order, while whole collections of paintings were avidly purchased to make the patrimony of the Winter Palace unique in the world. Columns of malachite and lapis lazuli testified to the enormous mineral resources of the Urals. And anyone who was anyone understood Russian, of course, but spoke French. This was the background against which Catherine embarked upon the age of reason. She started some erudite and elegant correspondences with eminent literary figures of the day, such as Voltaire and Diderot, also with other crowned heads, such as Frederick the Great of Prussia, Maria Theresia of Austria. She even wrote some plays en imitation de Shakespeare, it said ambitiously on the flyleaf. But these plays were mercifully short, which suggested that she had neither the gift nor the time for such a frivolous pursuit as playwriting. Music was not a gift of hers either. She claimed that, presumably with her eyes shut, she couldn't distinguish between 7 musicians and 7 dogs. Poor Catherine, how she must have suffered in this beautiful theater built for her by Quarenghi. This theater, in which many operas by distinguished Italian composers who are en poste here, such as Traetta, Cimarosa, Paisiello, Sarti, had their first performances. These maestros were hard put to it to think of any kind of stunt, such as stuttering arias, sneezing arias, coughing arias, spitting arias, yawning arias, anything to take Her Imperial Highness's mind off music. Catherine's flexibility with the aristocracy made this a golden age for them. She emphasized the creation of elegance in her capital of St. Petersburg. It was a showplace. It was like a kind of Brasilia of the epoch. It was more like a fantastic kind of a pavilion in a world fair rather than a habitable city. Everything was done to titillate the senses, and its large foreign community gave it a cosmopolitan sense and added sparkle to the conversation. But unfortunately, the figurehead had very little to do with the ship. Moscow, the rejected mistress, was relegated to being a large provincial city in the heartland of this country, as she had been in those bitter, landlocked days.
behind the palaces and the badinage of St. Petersburg, there was the same old mass of humanity which had not changed technically or emotionally since the first Mongol invaders disturbed their peace. In fact, in many ways they had regressed, because instead of the old tribal freedoms, they now had serfdom, and a bureaucracy of a kind governed their lives. And now came a hideous reminder of the time of troubles to disturb the elegant grace of St. Petersburg. Far in the hinterland, a Cossack by name Yemelyan Pugachev suddenly had the bright idea of declaring that he was in fact Peter III, who had never died, he'd merely gone into hiding. Well, he was immediately believed by the fact that he promised to free the serfs. The movement acquired gigantic proportions, and the revolt was put down by St. Petersburg only with the greatest of difficulties. Pugachev himself was eventually captured, caged, and executed in the Red Square in Moscow. And the virginity of St. Petersburg was spared. It took another 200 years for the serfs to gain their liberation. In this decree of 2 thin pages, whittled down from a lawyer's version, saying the same things at rather greater length. Catherine's summer palace at Pushkin outside Leningrad, built by Rastrelli, very badly damaged by the Nazis, reconstructed. The gardens are particularly lovely.
Россия необъятна. Ты не удерешь.
Your Majesty.
Вы меня узнали. Вот видите, он возвращается. Он знает, где его истинные интересы и кто его действительно любит. Не так ли, Мопси?
Well, of course, love and interest don't always lie in the same place.
Философ. Еще один. Их и так уже чрезвычайно много. Дидро, Вольтер, Д'Альембер. Как масоны, все они чрезвычайно высокого мнения друг о друге. Для них все так просто. Им никогда ничего не надо делать. И временами даже в их экзальтированном присутствии я не могу не сказать, что их разговор не представляет из себя абсолютной чепухи. Неужели вы философ? Для этого вы слишком хорошо питались.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. I think that even if a philosopher is well-fed, it's probably against his interest to look it. Now, I'm just interested in your reputation for frankness. It doesn't always go terribly well with autocracy.
А вы забавный. Позвольте мне вам сказать кое-что. Разные нации имеют разные качества. Итальянцы – превосходные тенора. Швейцарцы – великолепные часовых дел мастера. Из французов получаются замечательные учителя танцев. Немцы – непревзойденные короли и королевы. Вы же знаете, что я немка?
Princess Sophie von Anhalt-Zerbst.
Браво. Из вас получился бы хороший придворный. Вы русский?
Oh, no. Only up to a point. There are many people who find it very difficult to reconcile the extraordinary liberal sentiments you expressed with the reprehensible autocracy which you practice.
Приведите примеры.
You have said that slavery is immoral. You deny this?
Не на секунду. Но здесь оно называется раболепие.
But, madam, I hate to bring this up, but you spoke of it yourself. Your lovers, whom you compensated, I presume, for services rendered. You paid them money, which is understandable, but you also gave them serfs.
Например?
Oh, if you wish. I have it all here. Wait a minute. An example. Yep.
Vasilchikov, your lover for just under 2 years? 100,000 rubles, well, 7,000 serfs. Zavadovsky, only a few months. 50,000 rubles, 5,400 serfs. Simon Zorich, a few weeks. 7,000 serfs, and so on, and so on. Look, all this.
Вы что же, шпион? Вы, должно быть, англичанин.
Madam, answer the question.
Конечно. Крепостное право морально. Но в одиночестве у меня не хватит ни сил, ни власти, чтобы остановить его. Слишком велики кровные интересы. Это слишком дешево. Это слишком удобно. К тому же крепостные темные не образованы, чтобы пользоваться свободой. Свобода пугает большинство из них.
Well, you seem to see everybody else with extraordinary clarity, according to your lights. How do you see yourself?
Пусть это решает мое зеркало. Но другие видят во мне совершенство. Это моя обязанность — быть совершенной. Друг в минуту трудностей для молодых, мать для обездоленных и униженных, образец набожности для церкви, надзиратель для раболепствующих, человек для моего двора, где их так мало.
In other words, there is no consistency even in perfection.
Никакого. Самые высокие идеи становятся прагматичными, когда доходит до дела. Кораблю дается общее направление, а не прямая линия. Ему приходится соперничать с волнами и ветрами, и он делает вид, что временно уступает их воле. Но он никогда не теряет из вида порта своего назначения, несмотря на маленькие уступки, которые ему приходится делать по пути.
Yes, of course, a ship has another alternative.
Это какая же?
It can sink.
Вы меня забавляете. Без юмора моя должность была бы немыслима. Жаль, что вы не моложе меня лет на 40. А я лет на 10 не старше.
Do you want me to call your dog for you? What's its name? Mopsy? 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 Come on. Mopsy!
Нет. Он кобелек. Если я пойду, он меня догонит.
As so often happens, Catherine's liberal sentiments were stopped abruptly by events so drastic that they forced her into a completely unnatural posture of reaction. The outbreak of the French Revolution scared all the crowned heads of Europe, the more so when Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were beheaded. Of course, Marie Antoinette was an Austrian princess, and Austria tried to intervene militarily with her allies, only to be solidly trounced by the French Republican Army with its new proletarian ideals. Well, Catherine was as profoundly shocked by all these events as everyone else, except that, of course, she profited from the diversion which they occasioned to snitch another piece of Poland. But apart from that, she forbade all French ships in the harbor of St. Petersburg to fly the new tricolor flag, and she personally began a persecution of liberals that she had earlier on defended. When Catherine died, after a reign of 34 years, the extent of the Russian Empire was roughly that of what the Soviet Union is today. In other words, it occupied roughly 1/6 of the Earth's surface. The times she lived in were characterized by grace of manner and intellectual ferment. But they were also the times of the libertine, in which the fear of hellfire was more than compensated by the subtle delights of the flesh. Catherine's bedchamber was rarely a place for solitary contemplation. She lived her life to the full, but she always obeyed the rules of procedure, whether dressed in mourning for those she didn't really care for, or undressed in deference to those for whom she cared a great deal.
Coming up next, Inspector Morse finds more than murder when he investigates his latest case on mystery. Next. Then on Sunday, there's a new kind of prime minister at 10 Downing Street. But are his unorthodox methods a saving grace or a fatal flaw? The Emmy Award-winning thriller, A Very British Coup, Sunday night at 9.